Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the causes of World War I. I think this is one of the most oft neglected wars. World War I is fascinating when you start looking at the overlap of diplomacy and all these kind of complicated causes that led to the outbreak of one of the most tragic wars that the world has ever seen. I want you to think about both different historiographical interpretations of this. How do historians view the causes of World War I? How has that changed over time? I'm going to be teaching you guys different causes of World War I than I learned in high school in the mid-90s. And then I also want you to think about how different groups within Europe felt about the outbreak of World War I. So just as an example of that, and to get us started, how do we get from this, which is a spontaneous parade in Berlin in August of 1914, shortly after the outbreak of war? You can see people kind of raising their hats, cheering the Kaiser, to this kind of war weariness. People are excited in 1914. Everyone was sure the war would be over by Christmas, right? They would have these quick, fast wars like we saw in Italian and German unification. And what happened instead was 4 years of hell. The trenches were muddy, they were infested with rats and lice, there were food shortages. On the Eastern Front, the style of fighting was very different. It was very mobile, but it was very, very brutal. How do we get from excitement about war to war weariness? So when we look at the causes, you need to think about, where does this excitement come from? And as we move through the war, how do they end up with this kind of war weariness? So people traditionally had learned MAIN as the causes of World War I, and that's an acronym for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Okay, and we will get into all of these, or these are all important causes, but I think it's just not complicated enough. It doesn't really tell the story. Alliances, for instance, could be broken, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to teach you a different acronym, and that's IMANIC. Sometimes I am a little manic when I'm trying to get all of these things done, studying all of this history, studying for all of these tests. So hopefully that will help you remember. So imperialism, militarism, alliances, nationalism, industrialization, and a kind of general culture of violence, a willingness to go to war, a willingness to use violence to solve their problems. I also want you to think more complicated about how we can look at long-term causes versus short-term causes. Some of these are immediate, right? The assassination of the Archduke is kind of the spark that sets the fire. And some of these had been creating long-term animosity between countries and rulers for decades. So you need to think about different ways in which you can organize your thoughts about why the war broke out. So we're going to start with imperialism today. This is going to lead to these kind of long-standing conflicts amongst all the great powers. So Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. When last we saw them, they were just Austria, but they had created a dual monarchy by 1914, which is going to slow things down a little bit diplomatically, because now Hungary had some autonomy within the Austrian Empire and had a say, which is, if you've got two groups working together, probably going to be a little slower in creating decisions. We're also going to talk about Weltpolitik, which we've discussed a little bit already. That was Germany's plan for this new course of their foreign policy, which you will have read about in the Massie article called The New Course. We're going to talk about British colonialism, which, as you saw from our previous assignment, they really had created colonies all around the world, and the impact that those had on people across the globe, I think we're still feeling today. We're also going to talk about this kind of creation of toleration. I won't say that Britain and France really were friends at this point, but we've seen throughout European history how France and Britain have just been butting heads throughout this whole time. I mean, for centuries. How do they manage to get along and fight on the same side in World War I? And then Austria and Russia increasingly are not getting along. So what kind of tension does that create? So looking at imperialism, We're going to start with the Berlin Conference. This is just sort of a case study of where you see these conflicts playing a role in Africa. So the scramble for Africa had begun around the 1880s, and it was already creating a lot of conflict. So Bismarck, who you can see sitting at the table over here, calls this Berlin Conference. And actually, I'll link in the comments this image because you can actually identify each of the people sitting at the table. This Berlin Conference in 1884, which lasts until 1885, was meant to actually avoid conflict because as countries started exploring into the center of Africa, what they called in very racist terms, the dark heart of the dark continent, as they're exploring up those rivers and into the interior of Africa, it's causing a lot of conflict. So Bismarck's goal is to calm that competition and to kind of carve up how they're going to divide these rivers and territories. By the way, with no representation from any Africans, right? Like they're not concerned about what Africans think about this. This is just meant to stop conflict amongst the British powers. One of their things that they signed in the Berlin Conference was that they were going to watch over the native tribes, that this moral and material well-being would help suppress slavery, that they would look out for their moral well-being. And just to show you an example of how that very much did not happen, I've got a primary source here. This is from a woman named Fadra Amarouche, I think is how you say her name, from her book, My Life Story, which was published in 1890. She had an Algerian mother, so from Northern Africa, and a French father who refused to acknowledge his paternity. So here's how she described her childhood. She describes this in the third person, which is a little bit weird. We can talk about the reasons for that at a different time. I am haunted by a terrible picture, that of a tiny girl standing against the wall of a corridor. The child is covered with filth, dressed in sackcloth, with a little mug full of excrement hung around her neck. She's crying. A priest is walking towards her. The nun who is with him explains that she is a wicked little girl who has thrown her comrade's thimbles into the privy, so the outhouse, and so has been made to climb down into it to retrieve them. She is covered with the contents of the cesspool, which also filled the mug. In addition to the punishment, the child was flogged till she bled. So this is clearly not looking out for, if we go back, their moral and material well-being, right? Like they're treating her as someone inferior, as someone who needs punishment. Like it's really very brutal treatment. And you see accounts like this across Africa. The justification for this by Europeans was social Darwinism, right? So that they are taking Darwin's ideas and applying it to a hierarchy of the races. Now, sometimes people will say Darwin was like entirely innocent of this, but he does talk in some pretty derogatory ways about non-Europeans or non-whites in Origin of Species. And so this white man's burden, as we read in the Kipling poem, right, you can see expressed in a couple of primary sources from the time. This is a Piers soap ad. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. So you can really see this kind of racist language, both in the imagery, right? You can see them sort of giving it to this person sort of bowing down to them, but also in the description, the dark corners of the earth. And this is, by the way, what you want to do in a DBQ. You want to describe what the document says, but then also apply your thinking to it. So you have to explain why it's racist. First, you say what it says, then you explain why it's racist. This next picture actually is pretty shocking. The first time I saw it, I think I audibly gasped when I read this in a book in college, or looked at it in a book in college. Here, this is the same soap company, and they're literally washing the black off of this child using the soap, right? So a white child washing a black child and washing the color off of them. Matchless for the hands and complexion, sold everywhere, pure, fragrant, and durable. And of course, you know, there's this implication here that white is inferior and that black is dirty and unclean. So you see that social Darwinism in their treatment of colonized subjects, not just in Africa, but in India, in Asia, and across the globe. So looking at the map of Africa in 1880, you can see that, all of these empires that were in Africa existed. Now, there is some European colonialism already. Algeria was controlled by France. And you can see down here in the south, actually my thing is going over it, but you can see South Africa down here was controlled by the British. The Ottoman Empire had some territories in the north. Part of the conflict that we're going to see is going to be created by the dissolution and the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which they called the sick man of Europe. But you can also see all these independent African caliphates and kingdoms that we touched on briefly in one of the readings from in your article book. Okay, by 1913, though, you can see this has all been carved up. So the United Kingdom is pink, France is in blue, Portugal is in green. Everybody's kind of got a piece of Africa. And what happened here is, like, you can see the Portuguese here were in Angola. They've now gone inward. So what happens in this kind of new imperialism is, rather than just controlling the coastline, right? Do you see all of these little, like Sierra Leone over here is this British colony in 1880 is going to now be going inland in 1913. So now they're not just trying to control the coast, they're basically using the coast to claim the entire interior territory. I'll come back to that 1913 map in a second, because we want to talk about how that carving up happens and how it leads to conflict. Just to kind of take a look at Britain as an example here, they're really looking for strategic control to control. Industrialization has happened in Britain, and now they need both markets for their industrialized goods, for their finished products, and also raw materials. And so their goal is really to have kind of a piece of every part of the world, which, if you look at this map, you can see they really did. This phrase, "the sun never sets" on the British Empire, is true, because in any time zone they controlled, they had a colony. The way that they did this was this kind of strategic control of naval access. So let me show you the globe here real quick. They thought if they could control kind of 7 key points, they could control naval access to all of their colonies across the world. So the first one they wanted was Gibraltar. That gives them access into the Mediterranean Ocean here, right? So you could go from Britain, sail in here, and then access all of these countries and trade in all of these ports here. But that's not good enough, because they control India, and they really want to trade with China, who they'd been trading with for years. I mean, going back to before 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, China had really popular and high demand items. So silk, for instance, spices, porcelain, which was a Chinese technology that Europeans didn't have and would eventually basically steal that technology and know-how from China. So they still want access to the Far East. Now, you could go all the way around the coast of Africa, but that takes a long time, right? It'd be easier if you could go through the Red Sea here. So they want to control Egypt then, and they do eventually get control of Egypt from the Ottoman Empire. This Suez Canal, which now exists, is built during this time period, started by the French, completed by the British. And that will give them access to the Red Sea here, which means you also need to control the Gulf of Aden to get out of the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. That's a lot faster than going all the way around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, but just for good measure, they were going to control that as well. And then they want to control Sri Lanka, because that was a shortcut around the southern tip of India, which they also controlled. They wanted to control Singapore, which then would allow them to kind of get through this shortcut to get to China, as opposed to sailing around Indonesia. And then last stop would be Hong Kong. China had restricted entrance into trade with China, and Hong Kong was an important entryway into China. So those 7 key ports would allow them to control trade with almost all of Africa, Europe, and Asia. So, kind of moving on in imperialism, if we look back at Africa, one of the British goals was to control the Cape to Cairo. They were going to build a railway from the Cape down here in the south all the way up to Cairo in the north, which is where the Nile exits out into the Mediterranean. And that would allow them to get any kind of goods out of Africa, right? It's not about making railroads to benefit Africans at all. It's about getting goods out. So you see all of the railways basically exit out on the coasts. And if they could build this Cape to Cairo railway, that would make the railroad transport easier. But if you look in the middle here, they don't control this whole strip. This purple colony in the center is kind of an unusual one. This is controlled by Belgium, and it's actually not owned by Belgium. It's specifically owned by the King of Belgium. It's like his personal colony, King Leopold II. Belgium has really brutal treatment of people in the Congo. There were rubber trees there that had become increasingly important for industrialization. Think of like tires for cars and things like that, right? Gaskets, all sorts of uses for rubber. And the Belgian Congo was really rich in that. The brutality of the treatment there is legendary. There's a book called King Leopold's Ghost that you could check out if you want to read more about that. But that was a stumbling block. And then you can see that over here that Germany had kind of closer to what's now Tanzania and Kenya. And then the French had this piece over the top. So the British goal is this north-south strip, right? The French goal is in conflict with that. They're trying to control a strip across the top from east to west. And where that intersection kind of happens, roughly, this is not a great map, but where that intersection happens is where the Fashoda Crisis happens. And that's where the French will try to challenge British control of Egypt. So, speaking of the Cape Colony real quick, Cecil Rhodes is the guy who was the prime minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896, makes a fortune. He actually founded De Beers, which is a really famous diamond company, which still is in existence today, by the way. There are gold mines in South Africa. South Africa becomes a source of enormous wealth for the British. They had actually taken it from the Dutch. The Boer War is in 1899, so right after this period where they're sort of in conflict with the Dutch over who's going to control South Africa. Cecil Rhodes was definitely racist, was definitely trying to, rape and pillage as much as he could out of South Africa. Not rape exactly, but I mean metaphorical rape, at least that I know of. And I think that this is called the Colossus of Rhodes. This is a really famous cartoon of him standing. You can see literally do you see on the map how he's literally standing on the Cape to Cairo? And I don't know if this is like a telegraph wire that he's laying or what this string represents, but this is kind of a fascinating primary source in and of itself. They talked about him, by the way, in Born a Crime, those of you who read that. There's some mention of him in there. Now, all of this, so what? Like, why does this matter? Because if France and Britain are in conflict, how do they end up on the same side in World War I? And really, imperialism is not just about creating long-term conflicts, but it's also resolving some of those conflicts. So this is kind of paving the way for the Entente Cordiale, or this friendly understanding between France and Britain that will eventually lead to them fighting on the same side in World War I. So we see this cartoon from the time. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II here, and then these are really just representations of Britain and France. And you can tell France because this is like the sort of red, white, and blue skirt, right? And she's sort of dressed as like a tart, that she's just going with who's ever stronger, right? That's where the Fashoda Crisis comes into play. So the Fashoda Crisis happens when, whoops, I missed some of my animations here, but okay, so this Cape to Cairo north-south strip that I talked about with Britain, when France tries to challenge that in the Sudan, which is where Fashoda is located, Fashoda is a location, they almost come to war, and it leads to kind of long-standing animosity between them. So it's unclear exactly how that's going to be resolved. Now, they do avoid going to war, but the French public for a long time will be angry about this over the British sort of victory in this crisis and the results of the agreement about it. But in 1904, they do, after this, sign the Entente Cordiale, so that friendly understanding. Immediately after that, Kaiser Wilhelm II will come to Morocco and basically say to the Sultan of Morocco, like, I support you breaking away. Morocco's up here in the north. I support you breaking away from the French. And the French are like, what? You can't do that. You can't just come in and take our colony and say that you support independence. That's not how this works. And Wilhelm's like, well, I want my place in the sun. So the second Moroccan crisis in 1911, Britain will actually, when there's an uprising in Morocco, oh, by the way, the 1905 one is resolved with an agreement between Britain and Germany. Britain's like, you can't just do this. Challenges everything in Africa that we've got set up. Germany backs down. The second Moroccan crisis, France and Britain, there's an uprising in Morocco that the French try to put down. The Germans support the uprising, and the British actually send ships to Morocco, or a ship to Morocco, as a sign of sort of military support of the French. So this is an indication that the Entente Cordiale, that friendly understanding that was not a real strong alliance in 1904, by 1911, they're like, we're going to back this up. We're going to back the French up with military might if needed. So I think that that's kind of the beginning of a stronger relationship that by 1914 will be a military alliance. We also need to look at imperialism within Europe. And the example that I want to look at there is the Balkan Peninsula. So here's a map of Europe. This is the kind of breakdown of the alliances in World War I. And we're going to be looking at this peninsula here, which is the Balkan Peninsula. Now, this had all been a part of the Ottoman Empire until very recently. And if you look at this area, you can see why nationalism was so destructive to the Ottoman Empire and to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Like we've talked about that before. When you have these very multi-ethnic regions, nationalism can be complicated. How do you draw a line around, say, where all of the Albanians are or where all of the Macedonians are? Like there's definitely some areas of concentrations, but if you look at Bulgaria, there's still quite a lot of Hungarians there. There's quite a lot of Greeks along the coast of the Ottoman Empire. You see this in the architecture there, for instance. So this area became to be known as the powder keg of Europe. We talked about with Bismarck and German unification, how he predicted that some damn foolish thing in the Balkans would start the next war. He wasn't wrong. That's exactly how the war will break out, right? In 1914, in Sarajevo here, which is in Bosnia, that's where the Archduke is assassinated. That had only recently become a part of Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire is crumbling. That sick man of Europe is kind of losing control over the Balkans here. The first and second Balkan crisis are basically going to be about Bulgaria breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. The Bosnian crisis of 1908 is a little more complicated. You'll read about this in your Massie article called The New Course. But this area here is called the Dardanelles. And Russia really wanted that because they've always wanted their warm water seaport, right? That would give them access to bases on the North Sea and would basically allow them to have a navy. Because St. Petersburg, which is like all the way up here, is cold and frozen much of the year. They wanted navies down here in the Black Sea, which would allow them to be more competitive, and it all comes down to trade. So Austria agrees to this, and they say, okay, great, you have the Dardanelles, we'll take Bosnia. But what happens in 1908 is they basically jump the gun. They they annex Bosnia, and Russia never does get the Dardanelles. So this is going to create this animosity between Austria and Russia will see itself as kind of the protector of all Serbs here. They're also Slavic language, Slavic people, and there are a lot of Slavs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so they're going to be creating and intensifying an antagonism between Austria-Hungary and Russia, in part because of this annexation. There's also a lot of Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina who would rather be a part of kind of a larger Serbia than to be sucked up by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So only in 1908 had Austria annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's there, in that recently annexed area, that the Archduke will be assassinated. So that's kind of setting the stage for why everybody's just ready to break out in war, right? It's like taking all of the kindling for a fire and someone's just sitting there with a match ready to drop it. So the assassination will be that immediate short-term cause, but these are all very long-term causes for why all of these countries were already kind of poised to not get along. So we're going to be talking next time about the rest of the causes of World War I, which should go a little bit faster because I think you have more context for these. But we'll start next time with militarism. So have a good day, guys. I will talk to you later. I hope that that was helpful, and I hope you can refer back to it later. Bye.